to today's video. We're going to be looking at the texture and analysing how Bach has used the textures through Badinerie. So let's just remind ourselves of the orchestra. So we have our orchestra, and in the last video we looked at the roles and responsibilities that each of these musicians and each of the parts they played in Badinerie. So we had our melody, which was played by the flute. We had our basso continuo, which supplied that strong continuous bass, which then meant the harmony, supplied by violin 1, violin 2 and the viola, could just sit on top and support the melody. Now we need to know that for today's video, because we're going to be looking at texture. Texture in music means how the sounds are organised, or how the layers of sound interact. So let's just think about those roles and responsibilities. First of all, we had the flute, and the flute played the melody. Remember, the melody is the main part which our ears are probably going to be more attuned to. We then had the basso continuo, supplying that strong continuous bass, and the harmony, which would then play the chords and just play and support. So if we were to describe how these sounds interacted, we'd be saying that the melody is at the top of this pyramid. And all the other parts, the basso continuo and the strings, this string orchestra as we would call it, this string orchestra is really just supplying or supporting the harmony and supporting the melody. And we would call this an accompaniment, just supporting the melody. So therefore, the texture of Badinerie is melody and accompaniment. We have our melody, which is very important, which we're going to hear. It's where our ears are more attuned to, and the accompaniment just sit underneath, just supporting this melody. Now you might be saying, how do we know it's melody and accompaniment? Well, first of all, let's break it down. Let's just listen to the flute. We're going to listen to the flute and hear the melody and hear how interesting the melody is. We're going to hear how catchy and how our ears are more attuned to this melody. So let's have a listen. So we just had the melody, and as we heard, it's very interesting, very catchy. We understand now how Bach has created that melody using the motifs, and we're able to describe it, so we can really understand the importance the melody plays in Badinerie. So let's take away the melody and let's have a listen to the accompaniment. Remember, accompaniment means support. It's there in the background to just support, playing the harmonies, to prop up that melody. So let's have a listen to how this string orchestra, violin 1, violin 2, viola and the basso continuo, which is a cello and a harpsichord, let's hear how this string orchestra support the melody. as we heard there, that was the string orchestra playing the accompaniment. And we can tell it's the accompaniment because it is just chugging along. It's supporting that melody. So the melody is very impressive, whereas the accompaniment is quite plain in comparison. It's just playing the harmonies and it's just supporting that melody, so we understand what the chords are and the harmonies are. And of course it does sound, quite interesting to listen to, but it's not as interesting as the melody. It's not something you could really sing back. Now, when we were listening to the accompaniment, you may have noticed that violin 1 was playing bits of the melody, or it might have sounded like the melody was being played. Sometimes it sounded very similar. That takes us to another area in the texture. There's a bit more to talk about. I'm going to be looking at the word unison and doubling. Now, unison means playing exactly the same at the same time. So we play the same rhythms, the same notes at the same time. Doubling is another word that we're going to be coming across. And doubling in music means that maybe two instruments are playing something very similar, so it's doubled up. So let's start looking a bit more at this unison and doubling. Let's take the starter section A, and we're going to be looking at the flute and violin 1. Now, violin 1 is playing the quaver part of the flutes, so it's very similar. So I've just put a box around it and I've highlighted the same notes, so we can see it's playing B, F sharp, D and B. We would call that doubling. It's doubling up the quaver rhythm, as violin 1 plays the B minor arpeggio. If we look a bit later, when we have the sequence, you may notice that violin 1 and the flute play the same notes. However, violin 1 is playing different rhythms. We can see they're still playing the same trills, playing the same notes. It's just very different in the sense that violin 1 is now playing a different rhythm compared to the flute. So there is another example. We're going to go to section B, and we're going to go to the starter section B, where once again, violin 1 is playing the same quaver part as the flute. So we've noticed there, we've got F sharp, C sharp, A, and F sharp. Again, violin 1 is doubling up with the flute, playing the F sharp minor arpeggio, or broken chord. The only difference is the violin 1 is not playing the semiquavers, so it's not really as interesting as the flute's melody. Moving on, again, Bach is a genius and he's able to repeat and change the different motifs and the different parts. So again, we're going to start noticing some similarities. That when we get to bar 28, we notice that violin 1 is playing the same notes once again as the flute, but using a different rhythm. So we can start to see here, we've got a different rhythm as the flute. However, they're both playing the same notes and also the same ornamentation. So we've got trills here. The next thing I want to show you is something that's very interesting. There is a musical conversation between the flute and violin 1. So I've just highlighted it there. So you may notice that the flute plays the appoggiatura to the G, A to G, and then violin 1 responds, and it happens once again. Now this would be classed as a little musical conversation. So we've got the flute almost talking in conversation, if we think about it in terms of talking. So the flute is saying something and then being answered or being responded by the violin. So this little conversation is happening here between the flute and the violin 1. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like. So as the flute is descending, so is violin 1. So again, it's that little conversation that makes it quite interesting in terms of the texture and how these sounds interact. One of the final parts of texture is towards the end of section B, and this is when flute and the violin 1 play the same rhythm and the same notes, and of course we know this to be unison, so we would describe this texture here as violin 1 is in unison with the flute from bars 39 to 40. The only difference here is the flute, being the melody instrument, being the main instrument, has the ornamentation, the appoggiatura. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Again, another interesting texture to note and to see how these sounds interact. Thank you so much for joining me in today's video as we've looked at the texture. We've started to note that it is a melody and accompaniment texture first and foremost. However, there have been other very interesting textures and interactions between the flute and violin 1. I can't wait to see you on the next video. Take care.